Hi everyone, welcome back to class. You've now worked on 9:35 to 11:1. I have some documents for you to look at. You can see my entire study and I walk through that on a separate video. But I wanted to show a couple things specifically out of 9:35 to 38 and point some things out and show you another way of that perhaps you can lay out your work and see another way to do some detailed analysis observation as you continue to progress in your IBS work. Remember, the key thing is for success really in anything, but in particular for IBS, consistent effort put in over time is going to yield extraordinary results. So make sure you're practicing intentionally the things that we're working on, because consistent intentional practice done, again, consistently is going to yield the results that you actually are going to want to have for your inductive Bible study abilities. Anyway, let's hear 9:35 to 38 one more time. And I have it written up here. This is from the NIV. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." Now, I have our whole text written up here, and I want to walk through this and show you some of the things that I've marked and then add a couple of other elements. First of all, notice verse 35. This verse is the same as 4:23 to 25 and 11:1. This is how Matthew is presenting Jesus' ministry. In the first part of Matthew's gospel, or in the second part from 4:17 to 16:20, we see Jesus presenting the kingdom in word and deed. Right? And so, as we saw, 4:17, from that time on, Jesus began to preach, and he gives this announcement of the kingdom. Now, what does Jesus then do? He creates a missional community, 4:18 to 22, and then we get in this section that runs from essentially 4:23 through 11:1, where we see Jesus modeling ministry. He has a block of teaching, Matthew 5 through 7, his mighty deeds, verses 8:1 to 9:34. Then we get to this section where Jesus is now going to send out his disciples to replicate his ministry. And so we have a framing here of summaries of Jesus's activity. So our introduction to this section this is kind of both the concluding verse to 8:1 to 9:34, but also the introduction to 9:35 through 11:1. And so our passage begins with a summary, and notice what Jesus is doing. What's Jesus' ministry model? He's walking around, he's moving. Remember, one of the key elements that you want to see in Matthew's gospel is that Jesus creates a movement. Jesus is moving. And as we've kind of said in class, how did Jesus do ministry? He walked around, he was present, and he allowed himself to be interrupted. And then he taught, preached, and did cool stuff. Again, that's Jesus' model. Then he goes to the next place. And so what is he doing? He's moving through all. And all is a word that has to do with scope. And so the scope of Jesus' ministry is all the towns and villages, right? So he's moving around. So Jesus is covering a lot of ground. And what is he doing? Notice the three verbs that we have in the rest of this verse: teaching, preaching, healing. These are the summary of the activities. Teaching, preaching, healing. Jesus is demonstrating, signifying, announcing the kingdom in word and in deed. Teaching, preaching, and healing. Now, in this section that we worked on, when you did the survey of chapter 10, you noticed that Jesus sends out his disciples to do the same sorts of things. And if you look at chapter 10, verse 7, we see in 8, we see a summary of the ministry that Jesus gives to his disciples. So he says, as you go, preach this message, the kingdom of heaven is near. So there's continuity between 4:17, Jesus' ministry, and the ministry of the disciples. And then in verse 8, heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. So they're called to do acts as well. Notice what the disciples aren't sent out to do yet. That's teach. Teaching is reserved for the disciples after the resurrection. So if you look at Matthew 28, verses 18, 19, and 20, the Great Commission, it's only there that Jesus authorizes his disciples to teach. Because essentially what is teaching? Teaching is going to be the authoritative binding and loosing of the community, rooted in living out the kingdom's values. So when Jesus teaches, he is teaching the ethic of the kingdom. The disciples here are going out, announcing the kingdom through preaching and then doing their healing. Only Jesus teaches. And again, notice the summary of the preaching. It's the good news. This is the word where we get gospel from. So what is the good news? What is the gospel? It's the announcement of the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God, that it's now present, that God's in-time salvation has now come near us in the person of Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God. So this is the intro for this. So we see the scope of what Jesus is doing. And then what we see, the immediate beginning of the passage here, is that Jesus sees the crowds. And when Jesus sees the enormous crowds, again, coming out to him, what does Jesus do? He had compassion on them. And as we're going to see, compassion is the cause, is the fuel for the mission. Now, how is compassion defined? This is one of the assignments. You can go on and look at the more specific ways that we can define this. We can look at the other places in Matthew where this word is used. But just notice from a initial observation here is what do we have? What does it say about compassion here? We see it. It's a response to Jesus seeing the crowds. Jesus sees, and the effect is compassion. And the reason, the cause of the compassion itself, beyond he sees them, but he sees their condition, right? And so what does Jesus see? He sees the crowd. He sees their condition. And he sees that they have needs. They were harassed and helpless. These are two great words. And then we have a comparison. What does it mean that they were harassed and helpless? We have a comparison. We have a simile right here. A comparison. They were like sheep without a shepherd. At some level, this is probably an indictment of their religious leadership, that they're sheep that have no shepherd. And so there's a need for them. They're harassed and helpless. And so this reality, the compassion that Jesus has, caused by the need of the crowds, their condition, their lostness, their helplessness, their fact that they're harassed, their needs. So compassion flows from the recognition of the needs of people that we allow into our lives. Jesus brings the crowds come out and Jesus sees their needs. So that's an important piece. One application. One of my mentors, Dr. Robert Tuttle, or Bob Tuttle, he taught at Asbury for a long time. He still offers an occasional class for us. He always said a prayer that we should pray is, God, help me to see others as though they were my own children. Give me eyes that can see others as I would see my own children. And that's to be able to see the needs. And so that's the cause. The cause here then is Jesus' compassion rooted in his recognition of the needs of the crowd. And the effect then, it's interesting, is that the effect here isn't that Jesus then goes out and does more stuff. Now, as we read the gospel, Jesus is never going to stop doing ministry, but the needs exceed what Jesus personally can do as a human being walking around. Here's the issue. He said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful. There's a huge opportunity. Now, harvest language, and again, you can see this more in the notes, this has a sense of urgency, eschatological urgency. John the Baptist had already talked about the axe being at the root. This is an urgent need for action, an opportunity, the plentiful harvest, but the lack of workers. So the effect here then is Jesus telling the disciples of a lack of workers, and the effect then is that Jesus leads them to pray. And it's interesting, what's the prayer? The prayer is for more workers. So one of the key insights here is Jesus' compassion is going to fuel this missional movement, but one of the pieces is it's not that simply is that Jesus isn't simply going to take on more work, that Jesus recognizes the need for this kingdom movement to become a multiplying movement. The gospel comes to us on its way to someone else. And so Jesus is asking his disciples to pray that more workers will be raised up. Now, little do the disciples know at this point, when you turn the page and get to chapter 10, is that the disciples are the answer to their own prayer. So Jesus is going to commission and call disciples, and then Jesus is going to send them out with the instructions that chapter 10 is, the great missionary discourse. But notice that, again, Jesus' compassion leads to a recognition of the opportunity, urgency, and vastness of the need, and then a prayer for more workers to continue the work. And notice that the Lord of the harvest to send out workers. Again, Matthew's gospel is about the recognition of the need for a missional movement that's going to reach the world. And in Matthew 28, it's going to expand, and Jesus is going to send the disciples out to all nations. So this is a little bit of a way to do some analysis. Notice what I've embedded right in here. I've made some observations. I've added some adjectives here that help us to make some observations. Now, again, if you start with your work this way, notice what we still need to do. This kind of work begs some questions. We need to take a little bit more about what's the significance of harvest here. What does compassion mean? We can connect other parts of send out. So this is raising questions, but this can help us to get a baseline contextual analysis that can help us to answer the questions that we want in interpretation, and it gives us an agenda to set additional work that we can do. Again, I hope this helps. Again, check out the notes. Make sure you continue to watch the videos, look for updates, and work on the skills that we need to focus on each week so that we can build up the skills then that you can use for the rest of your life as you're helping people to hear the good news that we find in the Scriptures. Thanks for listening. I'm Brian Russell, and I'll see you next time.